Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with an interesting character build analysis. Now, a commenter, I believe, called Endvare, it could be Endvare, I'm not sure, mentioned that while they appreciated the original intention of my tier list series for newer players, it excludes item sets and finalized builds that newer players can ultimately aim for, to farm for, to at least start working on building as they go through, say, Elite or Ultimate, that I can't just look at the classes in a vacuum. And they're correct. They're absolutely correct. So, while I'm going to keep the tier list videos as they are because I do believe that they still are very important for new players to have something to launch off of. It is also an extremely valid point that I should have mentioned something that they can work towards. So what I'm going to do is, with this series, examine the combinations in the tier list and talk about the most powerful sets for these. Now, I'm not going to talk about individual items because you can add or subtract these from these builds as you please, and keep in mind that I'm also not going to be talking about a full 100% build. I'm not going to be saying you should be building this skill at this level and you should be getting these constellations. The constellations you probably will be able to kind of feel on your own. That's going to be partially how you want to play. Some constellations are defensive, some are offensive. I'm not going to touch constellations here. I'm a firm believer in adaptability, improvisation, and individualism, so I'm only going to focus on the sets because this will still leave any player with not only a direction to go in, but also some room to customize the way they want to. This is what I personally refer to as a focused build, a build in which I take an item or a set, individual items are possible for me to use here, and then as long as the skills presented in that set are present, then everything else is up to my current mood at the time or whatever other items I happen to have. So that is going to be the point of this. I'm going to be discussing, as I said, the most powerful sets for the tier lists, the tier list classes. Now, another commenter, Beto or Beto, I believe it's Beto, asked me what is, in my opinion, the best build to farm items with and push endgame with. Now, this is why I'm going to skip the first build, the first class that I mentioned in the S tier video. I'm going to go to which is the offensive one. I'm going to go straight to the defensive one, the Battlemage, because in terms of approaching this as a new player looking to push endgame, I stand by the concept of the Battlemage being the safest class combination to play, and there are 4 level 94 sets that the Battlemage has easy access to. Now, to specifically answer the question of Beto, I'm still not 100% sure how to pronounce this. If I'm mispronouncing this, I apologize. But in order to answer the question, there's actually technically 2 answers here, technically speaking. The first one, and if you're a really new player, this is the one I would personally recommend, would be the Markovian's set, which, all said and done, increases Blitz and Soldier, really increases key resistances of Aether and Chaos resistance, and increases your health by an extremely large amount. Furthermore, it also reduces your currently active skill cooldowns every 1/3 of the times you get hit. Now, the bonuses to Blitz aren't that important, at least not at the surface. There is actually an extremely good reason why I'm recommending this build, besides its defensive bonuses, but I would like to go through the actual broad set bonuses, the set advantages first. Now, first off, right off the top, roughly anywhere from 50 to 65% of the enemies in this game deal either Aether or Chaos resistance, because the main enemy factions here are the Ethereals, who obviously have an emphasis on Aether damage, or the Chthonics, who have an emphasis on Chaos damage. Now, each of these factions does more damage of other types, but their primary damage type is Aether or Chaos, respectively. So, already right off the top, you're getting some very important and sometimes difficult to acquire resistances. I know I personally rather struggle to acquire Aether and Chaos resistance on random drops. Furthermore, you have shield damage blocked. This is quite a large amount, especially if you combine this with shield training. You can block an absolutely massive amount of damage with your shield, which obviously will really preserve you. The +2 to all skills in Soldier, that's just a broad kind of blanket bonus, defensively or offensively. It depends on where you put your skill points. And the fifth part of the set, the most interesting thing with this, with the whole 5 pieces, is the increase in health, which 24% is an absolutely massive amount of health increase, especially as a soldier. And a reduction of the recharge to Blitz is actually pretty important. The damage here doesn't really matter so much for Blitz. It's not really why you would want Blitz here. But let's immediately go to our build. We're going to grab Blitz, and I'm actually going to go on ahead and grab Blindside as well. Now, the reason why Blitz is important for farming specifically is because when you're going through the endgame, and the endgame is primarily the Shattered Realm. If you don't know what the Shattered Realm is, it is basically a series of 4 randomly generated miniature dungeons, basically. And you are trying to kill X number of enemies within X amount of time in those 4 floors, and then at the 5th one you fight a boss, or 3, or more, depending. It really depends on what level of the Shattered Realm you're in. The deeper you go into the Shattered Realm, obviously, the better the rewards and the tougher the enemies. Blitz is important for 2 specific reasons. First off, this is the fastest skill that the Battlemage has access to, so you can clean up a group of enemies and blitz your way to the next group, thereby not wasting time running slowly through the dungeon. You are blitzing from enemy group to enemy group, which is also why Blindside is so important. This can hit up to 5 enemies and reduces their defensive ability for 4 seconds, so right from the get-go, you're able to hit harder, more accurately, and with a higher chance of crits, as well as hitting a large quantity of them for extra damage, and knocking over quite the large number of them, which gives you some immediate breathing room. So Blitz is extremely important when running through the Shattered Realm, because it gives you an absolutely massive advantage at the start of any fight in which you can knock down enemies. Furthermore, of course, again, using a shield to help keep you alive. But Blitz, especially with Blindside, is quite significant for the Shattered Realm. Now let's look at the individual pieces here. Now the shield itself gives you more chaos resistance, pierce resistance, which is pretty important for a lot of undead. There's lots of undead piercing damage going on here, and that can be quite problematic. You get bonuses to Overguard, which is extremely nice, because if you ever get into a tough spot, see, when you're going through the Shattered Realm, it is quite difficult to survive when you get down to the later levels, and Overguard will help you with that. Once your initial, what I usually do when I'm running this, let me actually tell you my process when I'm running rough builds of approximately, I don't necessarily run this specific build, it depends on what I'm equipped with, but when I'm running this, and I'm going to explain my strategy as I'm discussing these skills, blitz in, count to 3. Sometimes, generally count to 3. Once you hit 3, Overguard. You're going to basically be invincible for the next 10 seconds. Okay? Please don't ever get Markovian's Defense. It's not worth the reduction in damage. You get faster shield recovery time for less retaliation damage, less total damage, and being able to activate the skill every half a second. It's honestly, I'm sorry, not even every half a second. You're only taking away roughly a third of its recharge time. It's not worth it. I've never found this to be worth it. Every time I've gone into Markovian's Defense, I've always regretted it. If you've had a good if anybody who watches this video and has used Markovian's Defense and liked it, please mention this in the comments below. I hate Markovian's Defense. I have never, ever kept this on for more than a couple of fights, because I just always never do well with this. I have never done well with this modification. I'm just so much happier with regular Overguard. In all honesty, that may just be me, maybe my mindset, I don't know, but I always really enjoy Overguard alone. Also, keep in mind that you can potentially stun enemies while you have this activated, so that's fairly nice. But otherwise, it's, a fairly standard shield. You've got some health increases, you've got some damage increases, you've got the pierce and the chaos resistance is really nice. The maximum pierce resistance increase is actually fairly important here, because this puts you from 80 to 83% The amulet itself, again, we're talking about some pretty nice resistances. The maximum pierce resistance is here again. The elemental resistance is a little less important. The shield damage blocked is actually much more important here. Elemental resistance is very easy to come by, so that's not really a huge deal, but what's even more important is Markovian's advantage. Now, I actually want to talk about Markovian's advantage a bit. There's a key point here in that it adds plus 125% to all damage, and this is going to be important a little bit later, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. Let's continue going through the items here. Again, this is just the Markovian's skills here. There's nothing really else they're doing here, so don't be confused. Menhir's Bulwark, alright, which is just going to be your defensive abilities. This is just to help keep you alive. This is fantastic, by the way, especially for newer players. You get the 15% damage absorption. I mentioned this in the S tier, how amazing this honestly is. This is absolutely fantastic. Just for the pure defensive abilities. Healing effects increased. By the way, Menhir's Will, please. Usually. I almost always go for that. The retaliation damage, that's totally up to if you have that or not. You can slap that on through other equipment. This only takes up 5 pieces of your equipment. So if you have other pieces of equipment that provide you with retaliation damage, or you add components that add retaliation damage, that's fine. Don't feel like you absolutely must build Counter-Strike if you're running Menhir's Bulwark. Retaliation damage isn't the main focus of this build. It's just a nice to have more than anything else. This increases Blitz, this increases Blindside. Those are the fairly important things. The Poison Acid resistance on Markovian's Plate Mail is really nice, but otherwise it's fairly standard stuff here, Vitality resistance, keep that in mind, that's fairly important as well. Okay. And then we have the Visor. Markovian's advantage again. Increases armor by 6 to 10%, which is fairly impactful. And this actually specific piece gives you Markovian's Wall, which basically just is kind of like a... It basically functions as a random retaliation effect without actually being technically retaliation damage. It's just a nice to have. It's not really significantly important, but let's review. You have Markovian's advantage, Blitz and Blindside, Menhir's Will, Overguard, and Menhir's Bulwark. Now at this point, you're wondering, okay, that's nice and all, Professor, but what now? What's so important about Markovian's advantage, and where are we really doing our damage? Well, let me go through this. You're really doing your damage here, in Cadence. Now, despite the fact that you have all of this beautiful physical damage, right? You're getting all this physical damage. Keep in mind you're also a Battlemage, and you have a couple of options here. Okay? Now, you can either go all the way down to Fighting Form, which gives you physical, pierce internal trauma, AoE with your auto attacks. That's nice and all. Markovian's advantage will increase that. But then you're putting all of your eggs into one basket. I don't like doing this. If you have watched enough of my videos, you will know I passionately hate focusing all of my damage into 1 or 2 different avenues. It generally doesn't work. We already have Blitz doing physical damage and internal trauma damage. Cadence itself does physical damage, and while the bleeding damage added onto Fighting Form and later on increased by Deadly Momentum is nice, often if an enemy is resistant to physical and internal trauma, they're probably resistant to bleeding as well. It's just a personal observation. So I don't usually go for this. What I usually do is I go into Discord and grab Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, right? I've actually just kind of gone ballistic with the individual levels here. We actually don't need all of this stuff. And I will pop back here and grab Maven's Sphere. Alright, so now we have extra damage absorption here. That brings us to 35% damage absorption, as I mentioned in the tier list, which is huge. That is over one third of the damage coming your way, completely nullified. You're doing elemental damage on top of the physical damage of Blitz and Blindside. So now you're doing this beautiful elemental damage, which is 3 different damage types, which is pretty good. You get increased energy regeneration here. Absolutely all over the place. Now, it is very important you have Overload. Elemental Balance is a nice to have, but in all honesty, you can safely remove this if you really want to. That's not really strictly necessary. But Overload is pretty important, primarily for a combination of the Aether resistance and the increased offensive ability. I mean, the chance of the burn, frost burn, and electric damage, that's just going to be dot damage that you don't necessarily strictly need, and elemental balance just basically increases that, which is nice and all, but again, it's not super important if you don't want it. You can, or you can choose not to go into that. It's entirely up to you. Now, at this particular point, this is really where you begin customizing it to your personal needs. As you're going through the game, as you're playing through this combination without this equipment, this is where you really decide where you want to take this. Now, I often recommend, when playing the Battlemage, at least for early players, to at the very least take Cadence, Discord, and go into Escondra's Elemental Exchange and Overload. I often recommend this. I also often recommend Maven's Sphere of Protection. You know why. The trick here is, though, with this build, Markovian's Advantage not only does physical damage, which you're already enhancing through your equipment, but it adds plus 125% to all of your damage, including that elemental damage you're now doing with your auto attacks. Yes, that's the connection. So basically, your primary damage output is Cadence through using a combination of, well, primarily doing elemental damage and utilizing Markovian's Advantage and Blitz to deal physical and internal trauma damage as you need. Now, you've got a couple of other options at this point that you can go into, and this is entirely up to you. And it depends, again, on how you personally play and your personal needs. If you find you're still having a hard time living, go into military conditioning, add on shield training, okay? Maybe even go into veterancy if you really want to. But if you're having a hard time surviving, these are great options. If you want to splash a little bit more damage in, or you just want to hit multiple opponents, go into fighting form. Get that AoE in there. Take that physical, take the bleeding and pierce damage. Add that in there. Absolutely. Increase them over here. Sure. That's great. Do even more elemental damage with Deadly Momentum. It's fantastic. It does a lot of damage. It hits very hard. And you can consistently hit groups. You wouldn't even need Blitz anymore for the AoE effect. You would just need it to pop from enemy group to enemy group, and that would be primarily what you'd be looking at it for. I'm going to slap on the equipment in a hot second here. Actually, no, because that takes too long, in all honesty. I don't want this video to be like an hour. If I took the time to swap out all the equipment for the 4 specific sets, it would take forever. But you can see where the connection here is. Or alternatively, if you were really interested in doing so, you could take Kalidor's Tempest to add some Aether damage, some nice elemental damage, boost all the way up to, I usually take Wrath of Agrivix because I love the knockback, Inferno. And Wrath of Agrivix is fairly interesting with this build because after they get back up from the knockdown, you can blast them with Kalidor's Tempest, knock them back down again. And now they say knockdown target for X amount of time, but if you've watched any of my quasi walkthroughs so far, I haven't finished the melee pistols yet, but I will. You'll notice that sometimes there's a problem with enemies just not standing back up when they're knocked down. It's completely random and it's very hilarious, but it actually randomly makes knockdown the most overpowered crowd control you can afflict an enemy with, because just randomly they'll just choose to lay there, which is fantastic. Which is another reason why Battlemage is so incredibly awesome on a defensive standpoint. Even if you're not hitting them that hard, if you're knocking them down, there's a legitimate chance that they just will not stand back up, and you can just wail on them until they die. It's entirely possible. Another thing that I also am fond of building occasionally is Inner Focus. This Spirit will increase your elemental damage by a lot, because it's actually bolstering each individual element in there individually, so it's actually a fairly interesting statistically. But anyways, the offensive ability will help you be more accurate and will increase your rate of critical. But if you feel like you're not doing enough damage, that's just not enough damage for you, you could go into Arcane Will. I don't really like this with Menhir's Will because, you know, you basically can have this on relatively permanently as long as you're under 75 health, but with Menhir's Will, which is, of course, what's primarily going to keep you alive, when this activates, Arcane Will is usually gone. So I don't usually use the two in conjunction, and I do, between the two of them, recommend Menhir's Will. If you wanted to emulate the effect, I would utilize Fighting Spirit, which just randomly activates whenever you're slapped, and does not care what your health is. and achieves a very similar effect to Arcane Will. It's just not got the energy regeneration or the defensive ability, it's just the damage, basically. Offensive ability is nice, of course, but if you were trying to figure out, oh, I want to hit harder, Fighting Spirit. I'm not fond of Fighting Spirit, it's too random for me. I don't like to rely on that kind of effect, personally. But there are times it is extremely useful, so there is that. So, you could, like I said, you could go into Inferno, Caldor's Tempest. You could alternatively also go into Alexa's Flash Freeze. This will specifically enhance the fire damage of your elemental damage because it reduces fire resistance, which is kind of interesting. But you can also decrease enemies' physical resistance as well, which is a good time. This is, of course, freezing enemies, so it's a fantastic defensive ability that you can take. This is absolutely incredible. You could, for emergencies, take Mirror of Arioctes. It's not a bad thing at all. It's a fairly nice skill. It's saved my life countless times. But Alexa's Flash Freeze is an amazing option. Again, something you can consider. But at this particular point, it is entirely up to you. Again, I usually prefer the Elemental Cadence. Whether or not you go into fighting form and deadly momentum on top of that is up to you. Whether you need the defensive side of military conditioning and shield training, totally up to you. But once you get to here, actually I'm going to pull out these points here really quick. Pull this out too. At its core, all you need are Blitz and Blindside, Menhir's Bulwark, Overguard. If you, for the love of all that is good, take Menhir's Will. It's not boosted directly by any of the pieces of equipment. It gets the +2 to the soldier skills that the whole set provides, but please take this, especially if you're new. And Markovian's Advantage. Now, the reason why this is so important if you're new is because when you're new to the game, even if you've played other games of this type, even if you've played other isometric RPGs, like Grim Dawn. Grim Dawn still has a bit of a different flow than Diablo 3, than Path of Exile, etc. And until you've, hit that stride with the health potion and its regeneration rate, and maybe some of your other options, Menhir's Will just save your life without you even paying attention. You don't have to pay attention, you don't have to care, it'll just save your life for you. So, I almost always recommend, at the very least, if you don't want to take Battlemage, be a soldier, take Menhir's Will. That way you can figure out how you want to go with your character, and Menhir's Will just be there, saving your life without you even looking. Amazing skill. And for this build, this is the primary form of healing that it offers you. So, and from Arcanist's side, at the very least, take Maven's Sphere of Protection. For at least the damage absorption, it will absolutely help you survive longer if you take nothing else from here. But, like I said, I usually go into Elemental Cadence. I'm actually just going to put 1 point here to represent. I usually go into Cadence, and at the very least, Overload and Iskandras to vary my damage, because I don't want to be doing 100% physical damage. That's dangerous. You're going to find a whole bunch of things that are resistant to just physical and internal trauma damage, and they're going to slap you into next week. No one wants to be slapped into next week. They don't want to, and you don't want to. I don't want to, and the people around you don't want to. So don't over-rely on one damage type. Just the smoothest way I have found to do so is Elemental Cadence. You could also, by the way, as just a note, you could take Force Wave as an additional stun. I don't usually use Force Wave when I have Blitz, because I can just reuse Blitz. Just because you don't need to move doesn't mean you can't smack somebody down with your shield and do the same thing. So I don't usually go with that. I think it's kind of silly. But this is the build that I would really recommend that you work towards if you're planning on using your first character as your farming character as well. It's a very safe build. It does very well in the Shattered Realm, especially if you take either Calidor's Tempest or Alexa's Flash Freeze. Shout out to Trozan's Sky Shard to at least Frozen Core as well. I really don't like Shattered Star. It is a 12% chance of lightning damage and a mild boost to your crit and lightning damage. I don't much care for it. But Trozan's Sky Shard is also very interesting in that it will also do very well against the bosses, but then if you're running Cadence with the Elemental, even at this level, this will really slap bosses pretty hard anyways, so that's fairly irrelevant. And also, I would like to point out that Markovian's Bastion does not have a weapon in the set, which means, and this is key, Cadence, which increases whatever weapon damage you have, can either do physical damage, some element damage, or aether damage if you decide to go into Kalidor's Tempest and do a little bit, just edge in some aether damage there. And Cadence will enhance whatever it is. It doesn't care. Markovian's Advantage will enhance whatever it is. It doesn't care. So it does allow you to kind of customize your damage to the specifics of what you want to do. Now, what weapon you want to use, and this is specifically why I'm only focusing on the sets, what damage type you want to do is obviously going to affect what weapon you would have, and you can absolutely just go into just the Grim Tools here and look for the weapon of your dreams, and you have a bunch of different options, of course, so I'm not going to recommend any specific weapon. Again, I do encourage you to just take this as a core foundation and build around this to your tastes, because the way I play and the way you play is going to be different. Your needs when you play this game are not the same needs as mine, other than a base need for survival. Beyond that, what you need out of a build is going to be different than from what I need out of a build. You may want consistency, you may want something you don't have to focus on so much, you may want something really involved that you really have to think about. It depends on who you are and how you like to play. So I'm not going to recommend anything beyond the sets. You have 86 points that I would recommend you play around with to your heart's content. Go for it. When you're leveling up to level 100, to start farming, experiment with some skills. Maybe you've never tried Alexa's Flash Freeze. Maybe you played it in an earlier edition when it wasn't as good as it is now. Or maybe when it was stronger than it is now. I don't know. Try it again. Maybe you've never played with Wrath of Agrivix. Try it for a boss or two. Go through a level or two, or a dungeon or two with Wrath of Agrivix. Try it. Experiment. Don't be afraid of experimenting. You can die as much as you like, just pick up your grave and keep on rolling. If you don't like something, you find it's not working out, change it. All you need, like I said, all you need for a specific set is this core. And I really want to emphasize that with this first set, which is what I would recommend if you're going to grind through the Shattered Realm. It's fast, it hits hard, you can customize it to hit just as hard with whatever you need, or be more defensive if that's what you need. Now, the other set that is fairly effective, and this is one of the other sets that I really like for this combination. Let me just pull out all these points for a hot second here. Probably shouldn't have put all the points in, but I really wanted to demonstrate how many points you would have left with the core of not only what the set improves, but what I would personally recommend for the combination as well. But the other one that needs a shout out is Krieg's Armament. Now this is unlike Markovian's Bastion, which focuses 100% on the soldier and technically can be utilized with soldier plus any other class combination. The Krieg's Armament set is specifically for any combination of Soldier, Arcanist, and Necromancer, and obviously we're Soldier, Arcanist, and this specifically, interestingly enough, increases physical and aether damage and internal trauma, provides extra bonuses to Reckless Power. Now the interesting thing about the Reckless Power is the reduction of resistances with Reckless Power. Now, just so you have context here, Reckless Power is this, right over here. Okay? What this means, when it says 25 reduced target resistances for 3 seconds to Reckless Power, this means that as long as you have Reckless Power on, you're just passively reducing enemies' resistances when you deal damage to them by 25. Now, 25 isn't a lot, admittedly, but it's still better than nothing. So, let's talk about Krieg's Armament. Now, there's not a whole lot going on set-wise here. We have a little bit of a health increase, a little bit of offensive ability increase. You may have picked up on the fact that this is the more aggressive version of Markovian's Bastion, where Markovian's Bastion is clearly focused on defense, and any damage you do is something you add on to it on top of that. Krieg's Armament is definitely focused on that damage. You've got Krieg's Wrath there, which, by the way, is a lot of fun, especially if you have trauma from fighting Warden Krieg in his laboratory. This is fun. Anyways, let's look at the individual pieces. Krieg's Boots. Notice. My favorite skill for Shattered Realm. Blitz. It's back. Again, blindside, please. Reckless Power, of course. Over here, the Pierce Resistance is back, of course. Bleeding Resistance, Cast Resistance, that's nice and all. Cast Resistance is important. Reckless Power, Break Morale. Now, Break Morale is... yes, this. Now, this part is good. Break Morale is great. It's Skill Disruption, which is basically the equivalent of a Silence. Reduced Physical Resistance, that's nice and all. Warcry, I mean, you're reducing target's damage, which can help you survive, but it's not strictly necessary. The reduction to enemy's health is really nice, overall. But it's not my... It's a good skill, but I'm just going to leave that alone. I have personal quibbles with that are purely a matter of my own personal issues. I prefer more direct. It just doesn't feel satisfying to me when I use that. But anyways, Aether Resistance here, Mirror of Arioctes, which is interesting, of course. Now, I mentioned this earlier, Mirror of Arioctes is, of course, really great in a pinch. It just enhances it straight up. So that's just, you know, something you can fall back on in an emergency. It's a great ability. It is absolutely amazing. And you'll also notice, which is even more fun, Blitz's physical damage is converted to Aether damage. What does this mean, and why should you care? Well, first off, you probably can immediately assume, hey, look, all that physical damage, boom, and it's Aether damage now. But why do you care? Reckless Power increases Aether damage, but does not increase physical damage. So that means that Blitz goes from not benefiting from Reckless Power to suddenly getting 135% extra damage on its core damage output. Yes, indeed. If that sounds spicy to you, it sure is. That doesn't even include any benefits from Blindside. It's a different conversation. And then we have Krieg's Mask. Now, first off, notice again the skill recharge boost to Blitz. Yes. Notice also Aether damage to Warcry. Yes. Now, back to Warcry for a hot second. The 33% reduction to enemies' health is not their maximum health. It is their current health. So, at the start of a fight, this is amazing. As the fight goes on, this tends to be less effective. You're primarily using it for the reduced damage, and if you go all the way to Break Morale, you're also using it to reduce enemy physical resistances. Oh, look, now it does Aether damage, a set amount of Aether damage. Hey now. It now maintains usefulness as it goes throughout. I mean, 80 to 200 Aether damage isn't a huge deal, I'll admit. It's not the most amount of damage you'll do, but it does at least keep Warcry relevant throughout the fight, however big that fight is. And also notice Aether Spines. You just randomly shoot these out when you're hit. It's not really something you need to worry about or think about. Why did I just lose my way? There we go. Finally is Shoulder Guards, Mirror of Arioctes, Warcry. The chance to avoid projectiles is actually far more useful than you would think. The Poison Acid resistance is huge, and of course the attack speed bonus is really nice. So, let's talk about other adjustments. Now you've got Warcry, which is fairly interesting, fairly spicy. And, of course, you've got Mirror of Arioctes' Reckless Power. Now, how you approach this is going to be different than the other one. First off, I almost always run Caldor's Tempest with this. You're already enhancing fire and Aether damage, so why the heck not? I will still usually build Menhir's Will. Yes, I'm an addict. I do need help. And usually I will build Military Conditioning because I just straight up need the extra health and physique. Notice I haven't necessarily grabbed shield training or Overguard, because Blitz, while it adds the shield damage, still doesn't require shield, and you'll notice that I don't necessarily require a shield here. Now, this is not my recommended farming build for two very specific reasons. One, it doesn't inherently necessarily encourage the use of a shield. Don't forget Maven's Sphere of Protection. Two, you don't necessarily have as much to work with. You will notice Reckless Power is very damaging, does not offer you damage reduction. In terms of the Shattered Realm, you either blast your way through a floor very quickly, or you die pretty quickly. And even though you can have Maven's Sphere and you've got Menhir's Will and Military Conditioning, because you don't have Menhir's Bulwark, you're not healing as much, because, first off, the Menhir's Bulwark increases healing effects, which obviously includes Menhir's Will, so this heals a ton. You don't have the HP regeneration, you don't have the damage absorption, you don't have the resistance to life reduction, which honestly isn't that big of a deal. And you may not even have a shield if you choose not to equip one, which is entirely up to you. 100%. But with that in mind as well, it's a bit, like I said, it's a higher risk, higher reward kind of thing. You can absolutely do better in the Shattered Realm with this particular setup, but it's riskier. That's why I usually recommend Markovian's Bastion as a set for this. I just find it a lot more consistent, a lot safer to play, and with this particular build, there is a much heavier emphasis on Aether damage. Substantially. You may have noticed that a lot of this, even though it's listing physical damage increases throughout, it's also increasing a lot of Aether, and you're converting a decent amount of your your physical damage into Aether damage. 15% overall, and 100% of Blitz's physical damage. So, there is an abnormally heavy amount of emphasis on the Aether damage, which I do find personally a little concerning. I often find that when you're going through the Shattered Realm, in ethereal heavy areas, I have a hard time killing them. In just the ethereals, I have no problem with any other enemy faction by and large, unless they spawn a hero that happens to be Aether resistant, which occasionally happens, but the ethereals will consistently cause you issues here in the Shattered Realm, because even if you build a certain amount of physical damage, it's very common to have a decent amount of physical damage resistance throughout the game, because it's the most common damage type associated with weapons in general. So it can be kind of tough to deal with them if you don't equip the right weapon. And again, keep in mind that this does not have a weapon associated with this, so you are pretty much free to do whatever you want weapon-wise. It's just, you have to be very careful with it, because if you do too much Aether damage or too much physical damage, you're going to find yourself getting killed in very specific contexts, mostly ethereal contexts. So just keep a very close eye on that, but that's primarily why it isn't quite as much of my favorite setup as Markovian's Bastion, which I just broadly believe to be better overall. And furthermore, as an additional benefit, Markovian's Bastion works with absolutely any combination of soldier plus anything else, because Markovian's Bastion only enhances the soldier side of things. The other class can do whatever the heck it wants, or can be whatever the heck it wants. So if you already have a character that happens to be a soldier plus something else, Markovian's Bastion still works. By the way, I forgot to actually mention, where do you find Markovian's Advantage? Just wherever. When you are going through Grim Tools, just look down here at the bottom here. You'll notice that there is no specific, and I'm going to do you a comparison in a hot second. Notice that there's no, like, enemy name here. You can just randomly find these. You can the Markovian's Bastion set is just randomly found at high enough levels. You're probably going to be roughly, I would say, at least 80 before you start seeing these, probably higher. I don't personally remember. 80 is my low ball number for what level you have to be to see mythicals. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, or at least level 94 mythicals. I don't remember seeing any at that early though, but just as a low ball. But anyways, you should be expecting to see this kind of equipment, roughly speaking, at around level 90, I would say. 87. I I don't know about the 80. It's just something that I theorized for a while, but I've never actually gotten any proof. Wishful thinking, I'm thinking primarily. But you can get this anywhere. Anything can drop these. They're just gonna randomly drop from stuff. So, I mean, this could be shrines, this could be totems, enemy heroes, enemy nemesis, bosses. You just have to be a high enough level to be finding these. So, this has the other happy benefit for newer players in that this is easier to find, broadly speaking. Because, again, it is going to be competing with other just random drops on the loot tables, but you can technically find it anywhere, but Krieg's armament is not quite that broad. Notice that we are talking about specific... Oh, my food is done. Notice we're talking about specific enemies here. You have up here Terox, Fleshweaver Krieg, Valexteria, and Valexteria. Now, you can actually, find where these are. Just right-click the map, open a new tab, and it will tell you where they are. If you're looking to farm them, here's Valexteria. You'll notice that this glowed briefly. Valexteria is a pretty consistent spawn. But you actually have to kill very specific enemies for these. Oh, that's right. So, and furthermore, these enemies are in a pretty intense point in the game, which is ultimate level, of course, obviously. Ultimate level Mammoth, which is not a fun time if you're not prepared for it. Stack Aether Resistance, but you actually have to farm extremely specific enemies. You can't just wander around aimlessly, or even find this in the Shattered Realm. And farming in the Shattered Realm is the easiest way of getting stuff, so, again, Markovian's Bastion is my favorite set out of all of these. It can be flexed out to any combination of soldier plus whatever. You can find it all over the place, if you're lucky. It's got extremely good defensive bonuses, even with only 2 pieces. Aether and Chaos Resistance cannot be understated in its importance. And it gives you a large amount of leeway to customize the build very effectively, whatever way you want. I mean, I use Arcanist because I personally find Arcanist to defensively be the most consistent, and also bring really respectable amounts of power to bear as well, even in the context of the soldier. But don't be feeling like if you've got a soldier plus, say, an occultist, or a soldier plus an oathkeeper, whatever you have, don't think to yourself, oh man, I'm not a battle mage, I'm a soldier necromancer, this won't work. Markovian's Bastion doesn't care. Alright? Now, if you do happen to be a soldier necromancer instead, Krieg's armament still works. I'll talk about that build later on, because I don't find soldier necromancer quite as safe as soldier Arcanist, and I do recommend that for newer players, but we'll talk about that later. But, yeah, one of the issues with the Krieg set is you do have to kill extremely specific enemies for this, and that's painier than just running through the Shattered Realm and blasting every fool that twitches funny, which is all of them, by the way. Now, more experienced players may look at this and wonder, Professor, why the heck aren't you recommending the Arcanist-focused ones? It's because I am not that fond of them. Now, I'll explain why. It's mildly a me thing, but I would just like to point out the complete silliness of converting the cold damage to fire damage for Trozan's Sky Shard, and lightning damage to fire damage for Trozan's Sky Shard, when you're already buffing elemental damage. The only 2 contexts that this matters at all, 3 actually, technically, is if you are a Arcanist Demolitionist, you are an Arcanist Occultist focused on chaos and fire damage for some reason, maybe you like it, I don't know, or the third option, you are an Arcanist Oathkeeper. In all other contexts, converting one element damage type into another, with the Arcanist as the focus, which buffs all elemental damages, I find kind of silly, personally speaking. I just find it redundant in most cases. Again, there are 3 specific combinations where this actually matters, but the rest of the combinations really don't care. And in fact, this hurts the Arcanist Shaman combination, which I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but the Shaman Arcanist combination does not want this. It wants that cold damage to not be converted to fire damage. It wants that cold damage. It wants that lightning damage, as is. So, I just find it unnecessary, except in hyper-specific contexts, none of which the soldier fulfills, by the way. I'm not really going to talk about this build a lot, because for the combination, for the Battlemage class, I really don't like this. I really don't. I cannot state that enough, that this only matters, this should only be used with a very specific set of 3 combinations, and soldier is not one of them. I'm just cruising through it so you can see some of the conversions. Why do we care? Right? That's all I'm saying. It just, in this context, in the context of the soldier, it doesn't matter. The Invoker's Will has kind of a similar problem, but I will at least defend it on the grounds that, in fact, you can still use this very effectively with the soldier. Now, notice that you're using an offhand instead of a shield with this set. This is, I'm going to put it this way, and this is the reason why I'm going to talk about this one in pretty good depth. Markovian's Bastion, out of the sets available to this specific combination designed for one of the other of these 2 individual classes, Soldier or Arcanist, or some combination thereof, Krieg's Armament, Markovian's Bastion is the defensive set. This is what you use to stay alive first and do damage later. Krieg's Armament is much more balanced. It has some defensive abilities, it's got some damage in there. It doesn't do anything particularly well, but it also doesn't do it very badly either. It's a little bit harder to get, unfortunately, than a lot of other sets, so it does have that disadvantage. But in terms of its actual function, it kind of functions as the middle ground between the 3 sets that I would recommend you work towards. The Invoker's Will, although it contains only 4 pieces, and it takes away your ability to use a shield and focuses 100% on damage. This is the damage set that you can build around, so you can hit the absolute hardest. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh, but my soldier won't be able to use half of its abilities, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. You're focusing 100% on damage, do or die, burn them or die trying. Now, this has an overwhelming focus on Panetti's Replicating Missile, as you may have seen. I need to pull out these points. But yeah, I just really don't like Iskandra's Unification outside of those contexts that I mentioned earlier, which is basically the 3 classes that have some method of enhancing fire damage. And for this combination, I vigorously and violently recommend you not go with Iskandra's Unification. It's just not a good time. Stop it. Get some help. But for the damage-focused Invoker's Will, we're talking Panetti's Replicating Missile. Now, Panetti's Replicating Missile is interesting because it is one of the most technically powerful ranged abilities that you can utilize, because this thing absolutely will go quite ballistic. And this actually, I am going to sort of demonstrate. I am going to equip this set onto the paper doll, I guess it's called officially, so you can see exactly how insane Panetti's Replicating Missile can get, and it's very important that you see that. Which you'll just see here: damage increases, skill cooldown reduction, elemental resistance, which isn't that important, it's everywhere. The Invoker's Burning Hand, mythical version, distortion increase, the extremely nice and important Aether resistance, Aether damage converted to fire damage. Notice the emphasis on the fire again. I don't know which developer really loves fire, but they should probably talk to somebody. I actually want to, the Amulet itself is, first off, very interesting because it can actually allow you to deal some decent damage. Also, this really weird... it's a really fascinating change here, where you're seeing, if you pay attention, you're seeing a lot of these damages randomly changing. Alright, look, we're taking some of the cold damage and converting it to fire damage. Some of the cold damage is getting converted to lightning damage. Over here, the Aether damage is being converted to lightning. The Aether damage is being converted to fire. You have no more Aether, you just have fire and lightning at this point. Alright? Keep that in mind. Also, this just randomly petrifies people. You know, whenever they come near you. Every 2 seconds, an enemy turns into stone. This is exactly the same as every 60 seconds, a minute passes. You're welcome. And it's fascinating. It does have a little bit of a defensive aspect with the Invoker's Secret. It's a pretty good time. But you can see where most of this is just pure damage. You've got some resistances here. You've got Chaos Resistance, Poison Acid Resistance here, which is beautiful, by the way. More Chaos Resistance here. A lot of the resistances here, unfortunately, are not that necessary. You have a lot of individual elemental resistances. You've got the fire here. You've got lightning here. You have elemental resistances across most of these. I think only the amulet doesn't increase your elemental resistance in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. All the rest of them increase elemental resistance. It's pretty insane. But elemental resistance is not that important. It's, like I've said, it's everywhere. You can't spit without hitting 2 or 3 pieces of equipment that are going to enhance your elemental resistance. It's disgusting. But let's talk very specifically about the glory of... Where's mine? There it is. It's too small for me to see. Let's absolutely talk about the glory of Panetti's Replicating Missile when you really focus in on this. I probably should have just... There we go. Alright. Slap this on. Yes. Oh, wait. I haven't used this in a while. Alright. There we go. And then we have the ring. The rings, pardon me. Just go through here. Search functions are amazing. Thank you. And then... There we go. Now, we just have these, okay? I am not touching anything else at this time. And I want to go back into the skills. Now, first off, 3 to 5 fragments here, right? Alright, that's amazing. Good. 74% chance to pass through enemies. Only 1/4 of your shots aren't passing through people. Look at this. An 11% chance, almost 12, to stun people randomly per shot. This includes the bouncing ones, by the way. So each one of those individual shots, the initial impact, its children, its grandchildren, they all have this 12% chance to stun. So even though it looks like a small chance to stun, it's per shot. Oh, look. 4 to 5 additional fragments. Yeah. Your missile's grandchildren. You shoot 1 missile. It has roughly 5 grandchildren for each one of these. Now, you may not be able to perfectly picture this, so let me, in case you've never used this before, just in case. Each time you fire Panetti's Replicating Missile, it makes impact. I'm going to use the maximum here just to really show off the potential issue here, or the potential amazing power. 5 additional fragments pop off of this initial shot, right? All nice and enhanced, each one doing the exact same amount of damage potentially. Or roughly the same amount of damage. Depends on RNG. Great. So you've got 1 missile goes to 5. Those 5 can go to another 5. Yes, you can have 25 missiles running around. And keep in mind that this is, in fact, a point... there's no cooldown here. You just can spam these like a lunatic machine gun. Yes, if you have just now comprehended that every shot you fire is eventually going to breed anywhere from 15 to 25 additional missiles after the fact, you have finally pictured the absolute devastating potential of this. Okay? Now, you may be wondering, holy smokes, Professor, what's the problem? Why don't you recommend this to everyone? Simple. Most of the time, when you use this, unless you've got really excellent other equipment that keeps you alive, when someone gets close enough to you, you're probably dead. There's not a whole lot of necessarily defensive infrastructure here. because you don't have a shield. So a lot of these things, I mean, you can still use Menhir's Bulwark if you want, but Menhir's will requires a shield or two-handed melee weapon, and in order to use the Invoker's set, you need the offhand. Why is Blitz still got full points here? What is this? Get out of here. Now, what are ways we could approach this? Well, there are a couple of different ways. First off, I usually find it fairly important to go with mental alacrity. You need that energy. Trust me. You need that energy. Now, which one of the ultimate skills you want to go for is 100% up to you. Because, again, you're converting your Aether damage and your cold damage into fire and lightning. So, your Panetti's Replicating Missile goes from doing elemental damage, broadly speaking, to fire and lightning damage exclusively. This carries some risk, of course. As I've mentioned, you're doing elemental damage, broadly speaking, and that's quite a decent bit risky. But you can use either Reckless Power, which is my personal preference, or Star Pact. Whichever one you want. This one hits a little harder. This one casts a little bit faster. Totally up to you. Keep in mind, though, that Alexa's Flash Freeze is reducing enemies' fire resistance, and 50% of your primary damaging skill does fire damage. Also, when you utilize this with Absolute Zero, although Absolute Zero isn't necessary, you are freezing enemies out to 16 meters from you, and then you can just spam Panetti's at them, and then after they unfreeze, they're now slowed for 5 whole seconds. Now, again, you don't necessarily need Absolute Zero, but I do recommend at least trying Alexa's Flash Freeze. This, in combination with the buffed Panetti's Replicating Missile, is quite devastating and will slap through a lot of people, but again, you should still be considering alternative damage outputs. Which, of course, is difficult to do when you're not really enhancing a whole lot of damage. You probably have guessed the issue here with this build. The one issue I have with this build. It's a ton of fun to play, don't get me wrong. This is an absolute blast to play. You're seeing all these missiles flying around, and if you have epilepsy, maybe you shouldn't honestly go for this. This could be problematic if you've got really good graphics cards and the flashing might bother you. So actually, I'm going to throw that warning out here. If you have a history of epilepsy or you're concerned about it, maybe don't go with this. It gets intense. Although, honestly, Grim Dawn has a lot of visual effects that flash anyways, so you probably are already careful anyways. But I just wanted to throw that out there. But yeah, the problem here is that no matter which one of these two you take, Reckless Power or Star Pact, 15%, if not, I believe this, no, they both stick at 15%, I wasn't sure, I couldn't remember. 15% of your physical damage is being converted to either Aether damage, which is fine, or cold damage. Now, again, the primary reason what ekes out Reckless Power as the clear winner for me is specifically the conversion of physical damage to Aether damage, because at least Aether damage isn't elemental damage, and going into Star Pact is more cold damage, and besides the fact I'm just going to leave it at that, actually. That is the main issue here, is that physical damage is being converted to cold damage. It's another elemental damage type. If an enemy has no elemental resistance at large, it's going to be an issue. Alright? So I don't usually go for Star Pact. You can, if you have an alternate backup plan. Maybe your weapon converts cold damage into something else. I don't know. Again, I'm leaving the rest of the equipment up to you, for you to customize this to your needs. I usually go with Reckless Power, most of the time. And then, of course, you could go into Cadence. You've got Force Wave, which is also very effective with Panetti's. Again, you've got the Freeze. You could then slap a stun on top of that. It's fairly nice. You get Rending Force, some Pierce damage, extra range, Internal Trauma, great. Slower enemy attack, not that big of a deal, but it's something. Or you could go into Blade Arc if you consistently find the enemy getting close to you. Laceration for some extra damage. You could absolutely do that. You could go into Military Conditioning to increase your health if you want. You've got that option. You've got a lot of options, but diversify. You really need to diversify. Somehow. Don't just rely on Panetti's, and as amazing as Alexa's Flash Freeze can be here, keep in mind that it's not going to be a substantial benefit if A, the enemy can't be frozen, which happens occasionally, or B, they're so resistant to elemental damage that your Panetti's replicating missiles bouncing off. Either aether damage or physical damage. Grab one of the two. Maybe even both. Maybe even both. So, that's what I wanted to cover here with this character build, or builds, actually, technically, because it's 3. Again, a shout out to, specifically, I have my note here, Envare, I believe it is pronounced, and Beto for the comments. You are absolutely correct, Envare. I was looking at this in a vacuum. But I do believe it is important to separate the two as well, give something for the new players to start off with, and then go into this video when they're ready. So these are the sets that I would recommend you work for. Hold on, before I conclude, I would also like to point out really quickly the Invokers set you can also grab from anywhere. There's no specific enemies that you need to necessarily target and eliminate. This can also drop from the Shattered Realm, can also drop from anyone at any time. It's, if you're lucky enough. So I hope this answers everyone's questions. I will be doing this for each of the class combinations I discuss in my tier videos. I'll be starting with the S tier. I only went right to the Battlemage because it is the one I recommend to new players invariably. I'll be going technically backwards to the offensive combination next video, and then continue on through the list as normal, unless a request is made that some other build down the line, or some other completely unrelated build, would actually answer that question better. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It was an hour, which is about what I expected it to take. This is why I didn't slap on all the 50 billion different pieces of equipment. It would have taken way too long. But thank you all very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. I love to hear from you. You make excellent points quite often, and I am completely open to discussion, and I do appreciate discussion. So thank you very much for being here with me. I really do appreciate it. Have a great 24 hours.